The reason I got brought in as chair was because there was this large conflict going on between the two largest shareholders, and it had actually ended up in the UK courts.
Today's guest is Gareth Penny. Gareth began his career at Anglo American in 1988, before spending 22 years at De Beers, joining the board in 2003 and serving as Group CEO from 2006 to 2010, during which time he was the chief architect of one of the most dramatic strategic reinventions in modern corporate history, dismantling over a century of supply-side monopoly to rebuild the business around driving global demand for diamonds.
The chair should be the last to speak. The problem is if the chair expresses an opinion too early, then if anybody expresses a contra opinion, then they feel like they're going up against the chair.
From 2013 to 2022, he was independent chair of Norilsk Nickel, Russia's largest diversified mining and metals company, and the world's largest producer of nickel and palladium, a role in which he was awarded Russian Chairman of the Year in 2016, and from which he resigned in March 2022 following the invasion of Ukraine.
What happened was Norilsk had oil bunkers, and one of these bunkers overnight just literally split, caved in. And it should never have happened. The good things about it was that instead of denying what had happened, the reasons, the mistakes, they were embraced.
Welcome to Enter the Boardroom, the podcast for boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Norilsk, home to the Enter the Boardroom community, the destination for serving and aspiring board directors. Gareth, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Thank you, Ollie. Great to spend a bit of time with you.
Gareth, you've built your career across natural resources. You've done diamonds, coal, nickel, palladium, oil and gas. You joined the board of De Beers in 2003 and became CEO in 2006, but you'd been leading a strategic review before that. And at the time, I think De Beers had controlled somewhere between 80 and 90% of the world's rough diamond supply for over a century. But by the late 1990s, that model had effectively destroyed the company's value. The diamonds business was being priced at almost zero once you stripped out the Anglo-American shareholding. You've described historically the economic rationale for change for the business as overwhelming. How easy was it to effect that change at the board level?
Some of those statistics maybe I push back on a little bit, but your thesis isn't wrong. De Beers, by the end of the 1990s, it was a listed entity, so it was very easy to look at the market cap of the company, take off the market cap of the investments that it had, particularly Anglo, but it wasn't just Anglo, and look at what the residual value of the diamond business was worth in terms of the listed entity. And I mean, as you say, for much of the 90s, that was below $1 billion. And actually, there were often cases where it trended towards zero. And what the market was essentially telling De Beers is that the model that it was running, where it wasn't actually at that point that it mined 80 or 90%. It was still a very significant portion, but it was below 50, but it traded. It had these buying contracts with a lot of the other producers. So in terms of of the marketing or the distribution that it did of diamonds, it was a high percentage, very high percentage, maybe 70 or 80%. And what the market was telling the company was that the business model of essentially buying other people's diamonds and then sort of stockpiling billions of dollars of diamonds and distributing those onto the market in line with demand was not value creating. And so often if you looked at the dividend, for example, in the 80s and 90s that De Beers paid, it was less than the dividend that it had received from Anglo American. And so actually the facts were very conclusive. And the case for change was overwhelming. And it wasn't only the economics, actually. It was also the fact that from a legal point of view, De Beers was deeply challenged in a lot of jurisdictions where it was seen to be behaving as a monopoly. There were, anti-competition issues. There were issues with the Department of Justice. There were issues with the European DG Comp, it was called. So I mean, as a senior executive, I couldn't visit America, for example, which was kind of bizarre because it was the single largest market for diamonds. So the case for change, I think, was extraordinarily compelling. The question was, what did you change to? And that's, I think, what is often the big challenge for many businesses. The board and the senior team can fully understand why it would need to change. Often the process of changing and the kind of what you need to end up with is much more challenging. And where you get inertia is where the case gets made that where we would move to seems less value accretive than where we are now. You know, you're kind of comparing to the sort of least worst is the sort of kind of conversation. And I don't think that's a good place to be. And I think with these things, you do have to be bold and you have to imagine a future where you can move beyond where you are now and be very value creative. And I think in De Beers, that's where we got to. We realized that actually the business model wasn't working. There were lots of legal challenges. We weren't actually attracting the younger generation. People didn't want to come into the company because they thought that, you know what, the narrative around De Beers was actually a pretty negative one back in the late 90s. So all of these things came together and led us to want to change the company fundamentally.
Were there lessons that you took from that time in terms of how to create that new vision narrative that you've since found helpful in other board roles?
There were. So firstly, it goes back to what we were talking about. You need diversity around the board table. You need your experts, but you also need people who've been and done other things and have an ability to look outside the box and just say, you know, when we were here, we did this, or let's look at that example. So you need that open-mindedness around the board table. I think the second thing is often it helps to have some outside input. To do it all yourself, particularly you take a company like De Beers, which is over 100 years old. Essentially, they've been doing business in much the same way for decades. It's quite difficult to think about life beyond how you're doing it now in a very different way. So we used Bain as the management consulting firm. They, I think, did a particularly good job in painting scenarios and looking at other businesses that had gone through similar challenges, and the ones that hadn't changed in time and what happened to them, and the ones that had, and then those succeeded and those that failed. So they were quite agnostic in laying out, these are all the case studies that you may want to look at. And I think that process of creating a set of scenarios where you could imagine yourselves in each of them and try to learn the lessons from others is deeply useful in embarking on a journey of deep change. I also think that talking to you and reaching out to your stakeholders, it's so interesting how often, you know, when you're inside something, you kind of imagine that you must have the full data set. But when you actually go out there and you sit down with your customers, the business customers call it site holders, and say, we are where we are now. What do you think? And particularly when you get them to bring their own younger generations in. Because a lot of De Beers' clients are family-run businesses. So we had extensive meetings with our top customers and said, please bring in, you know, people who are a younger generation. We want to hear them as well, because we're all going to be in this together, right? And it was fascinating how often they would come up with insights that you just hadn't really thought about. And then I would apply the same logic on the producer side, you know, that if you like the suppliers, because they also have views about how the business could and should be run. So I think if you reach out to that wider universe, it's amazing how much they can tell you about your own business that you don't necessarily see when you're inside it.
Did you face any stiff resistance around the board table to the vision that you were embarking on?
I think the older generation are always going to be more conservative. And in a way, you want them to play that role because you've got to have your young sort of agent provocateurs, you're pushing and saying, let's do this differently. And then you've got to have your sort of gray hairs, your voice of reason, your experience, your backward looking. It's that combination. So there was some of that, but you know, I have to say, having gone through this whole process, we did this deep strategic review in 1999, which took us nearly a year. And at the end of it, there was a remarkable degree of consensus I remember there was a meeting down in it's a small mining town called Kimberley in South Africa. It's actually where the word kimberlite came from, because that was the first time that diamonds were found in their host rock. Up to then, you'd had alluvial diamonds found in various places and countries. But for the first time, these actual original kimberlites were found in Kimberley. And we had worked very hard and looked at lots of different scenarios. And we came to the end of the process and really were confronted with 2 or 3 pretty stark options. Do we carry on with supply control? Do we carry on with all these third-party contracts of buying? Or do we just, get out of these third-party contracts, focus on our own production, pivot the business away from thinking about supply and thinking myopically about demand, and how do we grow demand, and how do we build the teams in India and China and the US? And I mean, you couldn't do it overnight, but how do we move to a scenario where we basically sell what we mine? And there was a remarkable degree in the end of consensus. And it so happened that one of those wonderful African kind of tropical storms occurred at exactly the moment that we were taking this final decision. And I remember sort of looking out the window and going, gosh, this kind of feels like it's the right moment.
You had an interesting mix of shareholders with both Anglo-American and the Oppenheimer family, with potentially different interests, different time horizons. Curious to hear what your lessons have been in terms of governing when you've got a mixed ownership structure like that.
Yeah, so just to fill in the blanks. So in 99, we went through the strategic review. Then we took the business private because we felt that we could turn it around and implement change more quickly. And at that point, the Oppenheimers had 40% of the business, Anglo had 45%, and the Botswana government had 15%. So you had 3 incredibly different shareholders around the table. You had a sovereign government, which operated in a certain way. You had a big mining corporate in Anglo, and then you had a family business in the Oppenheimers. And, it was at that point or shortly after that I then became CEO, sort of 4 or 5 years later. And managing across those 3 different types of shareholders was challenging. And anyone who's in a similar situation as a CEO with those different stakeholders has to find a way to navigate through what are very, very different constituencies. And I have to say, Ollie, that actually then in a lot of other roles in my career, I found that experience deeply helpful, because if you take Norilsk, it wasn't terribly different from that, where you had a Tannen who was a family business. You had a big stake in the business. You had a lot of smaller shareholders in Norilsk. And then you had big funds, that had very large, US funds, UK funds that had large corporate positions. So, going back to your question, I think there is a way to do it. You've always got to go back to saying what is in the best interest of the company. And you've always got to remind the different shareholders that we have one overarching responsibility, and that is to do what is in the interest of all shareholders. You cannot pander to what is a particular need of one of them. And I think if people see that you're really serious about that and that your goal is value creation, it's amazing how aligned everybody gets when they see the value. In this case, if De Beers went up from call it $1 billion in 2000 to 12.75 billion 10 years later when the Oppenheimers exited. So when you're part of that kind of 10 times multiple of value creation over 10 years, you get deep alignment. The time when it's most difficult, I think, to manage those different types of constituencies is when the thing is not creating value, and when it's plateauing or even, spiraling downwards, then it becomes almost unmanageable.
You were awarded Russian Chairman of the Year in 2016, specifically for improvements in corporate governance. Really interested to hear, what does governance improvement actually look like in that environment?
So, the reason I got brought in as chair was because there was this large conflict going on between the two largest shareholders. And it had actually ended up in the UK courts. I mean, it had got to that point, and it was affecting the company enormously. I think we had a market cap of 10 or 12 billion at that point. And I mean, it was clear that it was really impacting on, how the media talked about the business, how it operated, etc. So the first step was to try to get alignment and to get the issues sorted out between the shareholders. And the reason I actually became chairman of Norilsk Nickel is I was known, but I wasn't involved with either of the two major shareholders. So you had Rusal and you had Patanen, Deripaska and Patanen. And both of them, I think, knew who I was because through De Beers, I had done a lot of business in Russia and we had a very long run relationship with Alrosa and so on. But I'd never been involved with either of those two people or organizations. And I think both of them wanted somebody who was neutral. So I think being neutral is a really important role that a chair has to play. You cannot side with either party, and each party has to recognize that you are there for one thing and one thing only, and that is underlying value creation of the business. So that was a very strong way of setting the thing up, Ollie, and making sure that I was interfacing and spending large amount of time with both of those major shareholders, such that trust was built that you were behaving in the best interests of the business. Then it goes back to all the things we were talking about earlier in terms of organizational structure, because if you allow contentious issues to elevate up to the board every time, the board meeting becomes contentious. It's so much easier to deal with those matters in the various board committees. And if there's a bit of argy-bargy and a bit of back and forth in those committees, it doesn't really matter that much. And often it might even be a good thing because people can air their differences. They can have different points of view. What you then want is a clear recommendation from that committee, and you want the facts and the egos left out the room when it comes up to the board so that you can have a very adult, very aligned discussion around the board table where kind of personal differences have been left aside. And that's what we try to do in Norilsk. We hugely strengthened the underlying committees. We got really strong committee chairs. We used external resource and counseling where we needed it to get those abilities up. We also brought in technologies and infrastructure where we knew that it would make a difference. So I'll give you one example, a fiber optic cable. So Norilsk laid a fiber optic cable all the way from Moscow to Norilsk, the city of Norilsk, 2,000 kilometers at a cost of $50 million. Now, why did we do that? I mean, firstly, obviously, it's good for business and it's important that people are connected. But really importantly, so that you can get real-time, incredibly accurate data from one of the most inhospitable parts of the world, straight, if you like, to the boardroom. And where there was one version of the truth and where logistics, connectivity, all of those things that often people use to find an excuse for why numbers aren't accurate or there's maybe different bits, all of that gone, right? Suddenly the whole thing connected. So we were able to take Norilsk through a journey of massive change very quickly. And this wasn't the only reason, but 10 years later, the market cap of Norilsk was $50 billion. And I think part of that just was a functioning board, good management. One is always helped by the market, but the systems and processes underpinning the board were world class. And I think that's really why I was given that award, which was, I think, an award to the company, not to myself. But I think those are the reasons. I mean, sadly, I should say, Ollie, that obviously with Ukraine and what then happened, I exited the company literally a few weeks after it started and have been, greatly disappointed by the events that have unfurled. So I do want to put that on the record.
The jump to chair is one of the most significant shifts in a board career. There are far fewer roles, the competition is stiffer, and a capability shift is real. Without exposure to how chairs actually think, how they lead CEO succession, navigate activist pressure, manage board dynamics, it's hard to know if you're ready. The Enter the Boardroom community gives you direct access to chair-level peers and structured discussions that build the pattern recognition the role demands. Visit etb.newrole.com to find out more. For a chair listening to this who finds themselves thrown into that sort of situation where they have, I suppose, shareholders in conflict, you've talked about committees and bringing in outside parties. What else did you take from that experience in terms of playbooks that they might be able to put to work in their situation?
I think the chair has to be extraordinarily thoughtful about the board as a team. It's a difficult one because you always want one or two board members that are particularly challenging. I mean, all board members should challenge, but there's a way and there's a manner and there's a style of challenging. And if it isn't done in the right way, it's extraordinary how one or two board members can completely blow up the mood, the way of operating around a board table. And I think probably every chair that you talk to will have examples of that. And it is hugely destructive. Now, I'm not talking about proper challenge and holding the executive to account and making sure that what you're being told is correct, and where there's something that doesn't work, taking appropriate action. A lot of what I'm talking about is actually stylistic. It's creating a negative sentiment around a board table, elongating meetings way beyond what they need, way longer than what they need to be. You know, at the end of the day, board meetings need to be fun. Board members should look forward to coming to a board meeting. You're probably only going to meet 4 or 5 times in person, maybe not even that number, and maybe 6 or 7 times in total in a year, right? But very importantly, the in-person board meetings. And what I like is the fact the boards I'm in, more often than not, people are saying, can't we have more in-person board meetings? We just like being with each other. We find that, you know, the bouncing ideas off of people, etc., is so important. So having an aligned group of board members who are constructive, whether that be in praise or criticism, there's a way of doing things. And I think when you don't get that, it's damn difficult as a chair to then manage the board, where you go around the board table and you just know when you get to board member X that the whole conversation is going to stop. You're going to end up going back 10 items. You're going to end up going down a rabbit hole. The materiality isn't there. Often it's to prove a point or make a point, and it's just not constructive. And what ends up happening is that the executive don't like coming to the board and don't enjoy interacting with the board. And so it's doubly negative, because what you want from your C-suite and below is that those people feel they actually want to reach out to board members. Not even in a board. I'm talking about outside of a board, where the chair is sufficiently confident in the interaction between the executive and the board members that, you know, there's not even, you don't even have to go through the chair to ask, can I reach out to X on this HR point? Or, you know, I came across this technology, you know, I wanted to share it with the, you know, with you know, the head of ops or whatever it may be. So I think that's your biggest challenge, is to make sure that the board is working like a team, that they are aligned, that they're all in the same togs, that they know what game they're playing, that they realize that the battle and the competition and the war isn't in this boardroom, it's out there. You're not competing with itself, you're competing with someone out there.
One thing I've sometimes seen in that scenario where you've got two shareholder board members at odds with each other, when they bring in a new independent chair, they both think, finally, this is going to get resolved. until the moment that the chair then aligns effectively with one of them who has got the quote unquote right answer. And then you sort of end up being back to where you were because that other shareholder board member was in effect being irrational. And once they see the new independent has not taken their side, you end up back at square one. Is that something you've seen? And if so, how have you unlocked that?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, it's quite a regular occurrence. I think particularly where you have shareholder representatives on the board. I mean, I think you have to keep reminding shareholder representatives that however if a shareholder has a certain number of shares and a right under whatever the shareholders agreement to appoint a person to that board, that person on that board is still responsible as a director for the company. I mean, how you got there and why you got there may be one thing, but at the point that board member sits around that board table, their fiduciary responsibility is to the company that they are on the board of. It's not to whoever the shareholder is and what that shareholder's interests are. So I think sometimes you do have to remind people of that. A lot of this, Ollie, is around spending time with those sorts of people where you just have to invest the time. Sometimes you may have to do things in a roundabout way where you have a pre-board discussion and say, look, we've got 3 items coming up. We need to, are you fully au fait with why they're being put forward? And, do you have any concerns or are there things that you want, us to think about before, etc. So it may end up taking a bit more time to get there, but I'm hoping that if that person is focused on how you create value in the company, that at the end of the day, the facts will speak for themselves. I think you need to be careful that you're not obviously seen to be aligned with one or other party, because I think as a chair, you've got to be agnostic. And you must try to avoid kind of boards that become segmented where you've got... So I think as a board chair, and it's not always easy, but you've got to work really, really hard to make sure that everybody around the board table is at least at a certain level aligned and focused on value creation. And I'm going to come back and use the same expression, but having fun.
So when you say agnostic there, let's say we're talking about a question of strategic direction, are you holding back your opinion on the strategic direction and shepherding the group to reach a conclusion and only sort of challenging or supporting rather than actually saying, this is what I as chair think we need to do?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, the chair should be the last to speak. The chair should, you can obviously open a conversation, but I wouldn't offer a solution or your answer. I think you want to get all the facts in the room. I think you want to try really hard to get every single board member to make a contribution in some shape or form. What I like to do, if somebody hasn't spoken a topic, on material topic, not something that we're just trying to, get through maybe an item for information, but I always try to make sure as I look around the room that I call on anyone who hasn't expressed an opinion. So I think you want to get that all. The problem is if the chair expresses an opinion too early, then if anybody expresses a contra opinion, then they feel like they're going up against the chair. And if they say simply what the chair said anyway, then people go, what's the point of that? So I think it's really important to try to let everybody speak, get everything on the table. I think where as the chair, you feel the conversation is heading in a direction that isn't right, in the sense that the facts are not being properly considered, you need to guide it. I also am such a firm believer in less is more. 2-3 hour discussions around topics. You tell me a case where you think that's really been productive. I mean, firstly, you can't remember what was said in the first 20 minutes. Invariably, it's the same thing that's just been said over and over and over again in a different way. Now, I'm not talking about you're going to make a big investment decision and you've got to get 2 hours of data in from each specialist who's presenting or whatever. We're not talking about that. But, where this is something that could be dealt with in a shorter period of time, in a more focused discussion, you're probably better off they've done it in that way. I mean, how often do board members, come to you as a chair and say, well, that board member meeting was far too short. They never do, right? They always go, God, they went on for days, or went on for hours beyond, and you've lost everybody in the room. People have drifted off. They're starting to look at their phones. They're thinking about what they're going to do, this weekend or something. I mean, that's just not, you want a high energy, high impact, focused, non-repetitive, ego-less discussion.
In 2020, Norilsk had one of the worst fuel spills in Russian Arctic history. And you set up a board level environment task team that you chaired. In episode 150, Sir Douglas Flint shared his experiences on being on the board of BP during the Macondo crisis.
Yeah.
Really interested to hear your experience and what you learned as a board member from that episode.
Yeah. So, Ollie, let me just give you a little bit of the background because I think it's quite insightful. What happened was Norilsk had oil bunkers, if you like, as backup energy supplies. And one of these bunkers overnight just literally split, caved in. And the reason it did was because when it was built, the foundations, the underpinning of the pylons that went down to hold this huge bunker, it was impossible to tell at that time whether they went into the rock or whether they went into the permafrost. Because the permafrost, I'm going to exaggerate to make the point, but was pretty well as hard as the rock, the host rock. And once you drilled in a certain depth and you put in all these pylons and you stabilize this whole thing, it should have been secure for a very long period of time. And it was regularly tested. And kind of all the normal, if you like, business as usual type things were in place. Where did it fall down? Because where the pilings went into the permafrost, and with the new world that we live in of global warming, and with the tundra starting to melt, the strength of the foundation onto permafrost was no longer the same as it was onto a host rock. And so the thing tilted and split. And it should never have happened. And there should have been ways of identifying this upfront, so one can never apologize or make excuses as management, the company, or the board, let alone as the chair. The good things about it was that instead of denying what had happened, the reasons, the mistakes, they were embraced. And immediately a process was put in place, first to recapture oil, which was done extraordinarily successfully, such that the long-term, medium-term damage was almost entirely mitigated. But instead of that being the answer, what I think Norilsk correctly did was to say, we are living in a completely different world now. And this is a world where this could happen to any part of our plant, equipment, supply chain, roads, transport systems. And we brought in, and this goes back to the point about needing external resource sometimes. We brought in ERM, which are an extraordinary organization in terms of, their name says it, environmental resource management. They are world experts. And they did a complete forensic, firstly on why the spill had happened and the reasons for it, and then what needed to be mitigated across multiple other parts of the organization. And what Norilsk then did is it addressed the immediate, it addressed all the red flags that of similar kind of areas that could be in a precarious position. And then it went back and said, now how do we re-engineer this whole operation right across the business? And I'll just give you one example because I think it tells a good story. Norilsk put in a satellite monitoring system for every building, plant, storage tank, etc., where the minute there was any tilt beyond a certain amount, so measured by 1 degree, it would pre-tell you that there was something going on at a foundational level below a building and whatever it may be. And these monitors were actually put in underneath every one of these operations or wherever. And there was a war room, a monitoring room, which actually could look at the screen of every one of these and actually recognize that there was a potential problem across any part of the organization. So what was a big negative in the spill became a huge positive in thinking about how to run the business and in thinking how to preempt climate change and its impact across the business.
Wow, what a powerful story. Has that changed when you go into a new business as a chair, the questions that you ask to anticipate unexpected disasters?
Well, one of which is I think there are very few businesses today that don't need a sustainability committee. I mean, many don't have them, or there might be a subcommittee within audit or whatever it may be. But personally, I would elevate, it doesn't matter really what you call it. You can call it sustainability and risk. You can call it, I mean, some people call it ESG, but you need to have one part of the board's operations that are myopically focused. Because I don't actually think there's any business where sustainability, and this doesn't mean that you are sort of, in the kind of camp where, you kind of every day worrying about global warming. Although, I mean, I am, it's part of the way I think, but I actually think it's a responsibility of every board to have in place a really well considered, properly staffed sustainability function that is thinking about all these issues way ahead of time. And as a chair, I think you get a lot of comfort from thinking, by looking at the risk logs of that committee, by putting in place a chair of that committee who is really thoughtful, knowledgeable about the kind of risks that, there just are in the world that we're currently facing. And so I think embedding all of that in the organization, as a chair, you don't want to be the first and only person thinking about all these things. You've got to make sure that the capacity and the bench strength is in place there where this is being done on an everyday basis.
What a great call to arms. And I guess probably really helpful to have someone who's had a few scars and knocks and bruises and made a few mistakes, because that, I guess, teaches a different mindset from someone who's approaching it from a sort of theoretical basis.
Yeah, I mean, and anybody who tells you it's not going to happen to them or not in my time or, honestly, be really worried.
Gareth, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Sure.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
Pilgrim's Progress, because it sets out the journey of life.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Eye specialists, people who go on about themselves and have big egos.
A question every board should ask at least once a year.
Do we have the best possible people? And are they properly aligned and motivated?
What's a boardroom myth you think needs busting?
That longer and more frequent board meetings are better.
Favorite quote?
Begin with the end in mind.
A piece of board advice that sounds right but is wrong.
We need a bigger board, we need a longer board, and we need to spend hours on any board item.
What have you changed your mind on boards over time, and how has that changed how you behave?
I think the more focused a board is, the better. I think doing more of the underlying work outside of the board so that the board is truly focused on strategy and on materiality, I think, are the things I've become more and more aware of over the years.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I think it's not making people changes quickly enough. We always want to see the best in people. We always want to leave people for as long as we can in a certain position. And actually, especially where there's a question of loyalty and alignment, I think sometimes you need to make those changes far quicker than actually, as human beings, we really would want to.
Gareth, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Ollie, thank you, and good to see you again. And I hope it's of help to, the wide community that follow and support you guys.
If you're serious about becoming a chair, the Enter the Boardroom community puts you in the right room with the right people and the right conversations to prepare you for it. Listeners get 10% off. Visit etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.